This is an emergency update from Unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland in London. We are joined by a longtime friend of the podcast, military affairs analyst for Haaretz, Amos Harel. And Amos, a huge amount to talk about because of this development out of Washington, D.C., late Monday, where you are, where I am, in which Donald Trump hosts a press conference. There were no questions, but alongside Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, unveiling what Donald Trump calls a huge historic plan for eternal peace, the biggest day in 2,000 or 3,000 years, the history of civilization. He's never one to undersell. It's his plan to bring an end to the war in Gaza and for the day after for the region. It's a 20-point plan. There are many, many things in it. The big news point is A, that he announces it, and B, that Benjamin Netanyahu formally says that he accepts it. The missing piece is acceptance from the other participant in the Gaza war, namely Hamas. They are as yet silent on this. When the event in the White House happened, they had not yet had sight of it, they said. Now they have. They're apparently considering it. So there's something sort of lopsided about it, but obviously a huge amount to unpack anyway. Let's just start off with your sort of big picture assessment of this. Some people have looked at this event and said, there's Donald Trump who has pushed Netanyahu into a corner, having to accept things he does not like. And that itself, what an amazing piece of maneuvering by Donald Trump. That's one view. Then there's another view which says there's Benjamin Netanyahu smiling. This is an amazing series of wins for him, that he's got it out of this. How do you see it? Big picture.
I'd take the first explanation as more likely. I think for once, Trump has pulled his weight against Netanyahu, something that I don't think he ever did, but he never did since January 20th this year when he came back into the White House. There were all those expectations. It's their fourth meeting in slightly over 8 months. And yet people were expecting for a long time that Trump would say enough is enough and coerce Netanyahu into agreeing to a deal. It didn't happen in the past. We're closer to a deal now, but I'll put a caveat on top of everything I said, which is Bibi being Bibi. This isn't over yet. And Netanyahu has been very, very skillful at outplaying Donald Trump for quite some time. And even now, he is playing another one of those Bibi games. It's about passing the blame to the other side, appearing to agree to everything Trump says. He doesn't have, I think, any other option, considering where we are, and yet hoping to undermine the agreement, whether Hamas would shoot itself in the foot, which is a possibility. We've seen them do that in the past, or whether Netanyahu creates a sort of an atmosphere, an opening for this to happen by leaking all kinds of bits and pieces from the agreement and showing us that he has reservations about them, by using the messianic right on his government, such as Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, to undermine an agreement, and all kinds of ways to slow this down, and in the end to bring this into a failure, which is, I suspect, is what Netanyahu would like. He cannot stand up to Trump under the circumstances, but he can still put quite a lot of obstacles in the way.
So the situation is that he can't say outright no to Donald Trump. He has to go along with it. But his hope is that he gets the credit for having said yes, but the Hamas make it easier for him by eventually saying no.
And that's a possibility. These are a bunch of raving jihadist lunatics. We've seen them make so many crazy decisions in the past. They are at fault for October 7th, of course. And we have to remember the man in charge now, Izzadin al-Haddad, is the fourth in succession for the Hamas military wing, which is practically the Gaza wing of Hamas since the beginning of the war. This is not somebody we have an acquaintance with, that we know a lot about. We know that he's deeply religious, that he was the brigade commander of Gaza City region in the beginning of the war, and suddenly he's calling the shots with some influence from Doha as well. Are we sure that necessarily this jihadist, who I doubt was ever out of Gaza in recent years, would really feel overwhelmed by the pressure from Trump and be forced to agree to a deal, which does mean Hamas, pulling away from control of Gaza, that's quite a big step. And there are no timelines. Look at the not really significant maps. These maps seem to have been drawn on a napkin at a cafe very, very quickly. It's not a well-built plan. Remember El Barak talking about the Oslo Accords when he was chief of staff, saying that there were more holes than Swiss cheese in them. This story is quite similar now. And yet we have Donald Trump, force of nature. And that could change because Trump is now really, really invested in that, whether it's because of the Nobel Peace Prize being decided within 10, 12 days, or because the Saudis are approaching him with all kinds of business deals, whether it's because Jared Kushner is back in the picture. A lot of things are happening at the same time. There's a sense of urgency. There's a sense that something is really happening. They could. I hope they will. The war needs to stop. There needs to be an end to the suffering. And yet, I'm still borderline pessimistic about the whole thing because of all of the reservations that we mentioned.
So let's get into why it might be that he would not want this deal, why Netanyahu would not want this to come to pass, because on its face, there's quite a lot of wins there for Israel. First of all, most obviously, the promise of a return of all the hostages, no phased releases, but all of them within 72 hours, that there is an end to the conflict in the form of, at the point one of the plan, talks of Gaza as a de-radicalized terror-free zone. Hamas would be disarmed. This would be supervised not just by the US, but by Israel's Arab neighbors, would have a direct investment in the disarmament of Hamas. Anyone who is still committed to the Hamas path is in effectively a legitimate target. Everyone else gets an amnesty and has to leave once they've handed over their weapons. And as you've said, it's not as if there's a very firm date for Israel withdrawing. And even the language on an eventual Palestinian state is so vague and so long-term. It's not as if Netanyahu has to give up something now. What is it about this deal that he would find hard to stomach?
Look, Jonathan, one thing we can be sure of is that if he is coerced into agreeing to a deal, if this continues and Hamas says yes or yes but, and within a few days or weeks a deal is signed, both Netanyahu and his minions in the press, in Israeli TV channels and so on, will present this as a great victory. There will be the spin doctors will be at work for 24/7 to convince us that this is another great victory for our great leader. But other than that, there are a lot of things not to like from his point of view. Hamas is not demolished completely. It's giving up power to an extent, but it will remain a force in the Gaza Strip and on the Palestinian arena. We don't know exactly what would happen to Hamas weapons. We've seen the kind of arrangements that they're trying to implement in Lebanon with Hezbollah. Hamas is a more immediate danger, although Hezbollah is, of course, stronger. And what about all of those messianic right-wing delusions that people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have, and that Netanyahu was borderline sympathetic towards for quite some time? Resuming settlements, Israeli settlements in Gaza, transfer forced, which was presented as voluntary transfer of population. He probably wouldn't have a government for a long time. This would probably mean elections, something that he's not crazy about considering the polls. If the war ends and he doesn't win the elections, there will be an investigation and a public investigation. And he has a lot to answer over this. So there are a lot of things not to like. He was forced into this, what Ariel Sharon used to call the corrales, this very narrow corridor, which the bull is pushed into in a bullfight in Spain. So Netanyahu is more or less on the edge of this corrales, and he has to act as if it's perfectly normal and this is what he wanted all the time. But as much as he can help it, he would try, as much as I can understand him, and I haven't had access to him for a long time. My sense is that he would try to postpone. He would try to find other optional ways to proceed, and he'd rather not go all the way. If worse comes to worse, then he will budge under the pressure. He would withdraw under pressure. But this is not yet where we are. All of this depends on how much weight Trump carries with him and how far he's willing to take Netanyahu on this right.
Yeah, I mean, there are from Hamas's point of view, there are things that they too could point to as successes, which make it all the more unpalatable or difficult to swallow, certainly for Netanyahu.
For instance, Jonathan, 250 murderers.
Well, that's what I was just about
That's
to
a
say. I was
significant
going to.
number
It's
would be
really
released.
significant. The 250 people sentenced to life imprisonment. That is the hardest of hardcore Hamas prisoners.
In my view, considering where we are right now, this is a price I think I would be, as an Israeli, I'm willing to pay, considering there are lives of 20 hostages, more or less, who are depending on that, and considering the fact that it could save lives of soldiers fighting in Gaza and also Palestinian lives. And yet, this is quite an obstacle in the eyes of the Israeli public opinion.
Yeah, and particularly on his right, and we've already heard noises about that. And you mentioned the point about the weapons and the promise to forswear annexation and settlement. So those are all points in there that make it difficult for Netanyahu to say yes, but would make it more palatable to Hamas. The question about whether Hamas get to yes, we've talked about the pressure Donald Trump himself can put on. What levers do the likes of Qatar and the other Arab players in this, what pressure can they bring to bear on Hamas, do you think, that would make, despite the reservations Hamas would definitely have about saying yes to this, might make them say yes enough for this at least to go through to a next stage?
So we should make the distinction between the Hamas foreign leadership, of those who are abroad, and the people who remain in Gaza. Gaza has been through hell in the last 2 years. The Hamas leadership there, what remains of it, is hiding in tunnels and in bunkers underground for a long time. They are extremely ideological and apparently willing to suffer, and yet there's no direct pressure on them. How can you threaten them? Less money, less weapons being supplied, and so on. Maybe Egypt threatening with, I don't know, total closure of the border in Rafah to people who are trying to leave Gaza. I don't know how much leeway, how much leverage they have. Regarding the leadership in Doha, that's another matter. I think the fact this foolish assassination attempt made by Netanyahu on September 9th did push Hamas and their hosts in Doha closer together. Right now, apparently, Qatar is satisfied with Bibi being forced to admit failure and to apologize to the Qatari prime minister yesterday. And under these circumstances, it's willing to go back to its role and to pay the price necessary from Trump's point of view, which is applying pressure on Qatar, on the Hamas leadership in Doha. Will that be enough? It's too soon to tell. I think my sense is that we'll get a sort of a yes but response from Hamas. The Qataris, the Saudis, others would say that this needs some work to do. And the main question is, will Trump lose interest as he tends to do, or will he apply more pressure as he's sometimes capable of doing?
I want to come to the Netanyahu apology to Qatar in a moment, but just before we do, how important as leverage in the minds of the Hamas decision makers, whether in Gaza or in Doha, do you think it will be that the other part of this announcement yesterday was that if Hamas do not accept, then Donald Trump gives a green light for Netanyahu and Israel to finish the job, meaning by military means, by force. Is there more that Israel can do militarily that will concentrate the minds of, frighten Hamas commanders? Or is that in a way, rhetorical talk, and really everything Israel can throw at this, they have thrown at it already?
I think it's more than rhetoric. I think in the end, Hamas is frightened of the possible consequences. It would be a great loss for Hamas if they have to leave, the leadership and the fighters have to leave Gaza. And think of the destruction. We saw what happened in Rafah, in Khan Yunis, in Bet Hanun. Gaza City, which is the center of the Gaza Strip, where the leadership was shown, where Hamas's power has been shown for years. If that would be destroyed, that would be a high price to pay. Is that enough to persuade somebody like Haddad? I don't know. What kind of commitment does he have to people above ground? So many Palestinians have been killed during this war, 2 years almost, 66,000 people, the majority of them civilians, have been killed. Does the Hamas leadership underground care about that? I'm not too sure. And yet this is this is massive destruction, and this would mean an even more serious military defeat for Hamas. So I think that this is something that they're calculating right now. They're considering the possible implications. I think that there's the threat is considerable, and this is something that they have to think about if it doesn't happen. For Netanyahu, it's quite clear that this is the preferred way, but Trump isn't playing along, at least for the time being. How serious they are, you don't know. It's a sort of a high stakes poker game right now. But if there's a chance, it has to do with the fact that, again, that Trump is actually present here, that he's not just talking. I mean, the his train of thought yesterday was quite amusing, and yet he's there to deal with that. And again, the consequences could be terrible, and even the Hamas leadership has to think of that, whether it's in the they're staying in the villas in Doha or underground in Gaza.
Yeah, I think that your reading of how involved Donald Trump must be right. That whole point about him making himself the president of this board of peace, as he called it, he's tied to this, and its failure will be a failure for him. And all that hype.
Trump being Trump, he would probably present it the way he likes. But I think that we can see the fingerprints of two people here, Tony Blair and Jared Kushner. And this is quite different than Steve Witkoff. I'm not saying that this is the A-team. We've seen them fail in the past and on many different aspects, and yet there is a slightly more serious attitude. Again, not enough mind to details, but these are people who have more experience than Witkoff and who are trying to push this forward. Kushner has constantly told Israelis he spoke to in recent weeks that he's finally invested in that. I think that also means that the Trump family is invested in that for their business deals, the outcome regarding Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so on. But that's important as well.
Yeah, let's just do something on this apology. This was the statement that the phone call that Netanyahu had seemingly from the White House to the Prime Minister of Qatar, essentially under duress, with a sort of metaphorical gun to his head from Donald Trump, in which he is forced to apologize to the leadership in Qatar for Israel's failed raid on the Hamas leadership in Doha. There was a less apologetic version of that in the public statement. When Netanyahu spoke himself, he spoke of regret, but it wasn't quite a fulsome apology. But the readout from the White House suggests that he was actually made to apologize to the leadership in Qatar. Again, we talked about this when it happened. This is the sense in which the Israeli attack on the leadership in Qatar was in some ways seen as an insult to the United States, because Qatar is a partner, ally of Washington's, and particularly of Donald Trump's because of his kind of personal relationships. What does it mean? What's the significance of the fact that Netanyahu was forced to apologize? I noticed that was the thing that the Israeli right attacked him on after this plan, Smotrich comparing him to Chamberlain for doing this apology. Just unpack for us what you think is going on with that apology and how significant it might be.
I would compare Netanyahu to Netanyahu, the 97 versions. What we see here are ghosts of 97, the Mashal affair. Netanyahu was a very young, inexperienced prime minister, ordering the assassination of Khaled Mashal, who's still present with us now, as we know, is also in Doha, but then a leader of the Hamas political wing in Amman. A failed assassination by two Mossad agents, and then his life being rescued with Israel's help. And again, Israel being forced to apologize to King Hussein to release Sheikh Yassin. Sheikh Yassin is no longer with us. There's nobody to release over that. And yet it's the same kind of humiliation, the same kind of failure that begins with Netanyahu not thinking things straight and not planning for possible consequences. He took a huge gamble. And unlike many of the other attacks, all of them during this war, whether it's Yemen or Lebanon or assassinations in Tehran, Hania, and so on, this one didn't work out well. Apparently all this talk about Qatar being sorts of double agents that need to be dealt with and so on, these are all empty words, because in the end, Qatar is very close to the United States, especially to the Trump family, very dear to Trump himself. And Israel needs Qatar in spite of all the reservations we have about this very, very corrupt state, which is in bed with the Islamic Brotherhood and has been helping Hamas for so many years. You still need them for the current situation. Netanyahu didn't have any choice. One, as you said, a metaphorical gun to the head by Trump. And secondly, if you want them to help, and Netanyahu at least has to go through the motions and to show that he's interested in the deal, then you need the Qataris on board. The real question is what kind of calculation Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are having now regarding the right time for them to pull out of the government and to force new elections. They're not going to. I'm not a mitzegel. I don't know enough about this, but my assumption is that they're not going to stay along for this kind of ride if it means releasing all of those prisoners and moving out of the Gaza Strip, withdrawing and so on. And that's the main deal. They found an excuse. It was a headline by Barak Ravid on Channel 12 last night. It made a lot of noise in Israel. This is something that they could use against Netanyahu, perhaps help them with their own voters to show that they're not part of this terrible surrender. But other than that, I don't find this extremely important.
Good. And just to anyone who didn't get the reference, Amit Segal, of course, Yonit's colleague on Channel 12, who is seen as the journalist with a very close insight into the mind of Prime Minister Netanyahu. There are some people who are incurable optimists, despite everything this region has to throw at them, who say, look, there are two big positives here. Yes, it may be vague and abstract and in the long distance, but in this statement, Benjamin Netanyahu has, at least in principle, given some kind of approval to the concept of a Palestinian state. I notice Netanyahu himself has been quite quick to say, I've done no such thing. All this document does is recognize that Palestinians aspire to a Palestinian state. It doesn't say whether Israel is in any mood to grant that. And anyway, it's conditional on so many long-term things, including reform of the Palestinian Authority, which could be the work of decades, and so on. But optimists cling to that. And then the other thing is this achievement in getting, the bulk of the Arab world to line up on a position that an Israeli prime minister of the right could live with, that there are some people who see in that the outlines of an eventual future for this conflict, even if there are many, many obstacles between here and there. It's not my own view. I think I'm seeing, I'm afraid I'm seeing the cloud more than the silver lining. But I'm interested to know whether you think those optimists are right to at least see something here.
So there's a difference between the two issues here. Regarding the Palestinian state, I'd back Netanyahu on this. He hasn't been serious on a Palestinian state ever. In fact, his main goal in life, except for staying in power and bombing Iran, was to prevent the Palestinian state. He paid lip service to this noble idea, if you'd like to call it that way, in 2009 because Obama forced him to do that with the Cairo speech and then Obama's Cairo speech and Netanyahu's Bar Ilan speech. But he never believed in that. And even now, he would find any way, any loophole to use in order to avoid that. I'm not sure the text matters a lot regarding that. And I think we have a long way to go, mostly because of October 7th, because what Israelis feel about Palestinians, how they mistrust them, how they suspect that there will be more bloodshed if there are more evacuations of territory and so on. So I don't think it's in the cards right now. Arab involvement, including PA involvement in Gaza, is extremely important. If there's a way out, then this is the way out. And of course, the bloodshed needs to end. It should have been done a long time ago, but right now, this is the main event. And with Arab support, that means that Palestinians may be on board, the Palestinian public, as much as anybody's paying attention to them, and that Hamas has less space of maneuvering if there's so much applied pressure from Egypt, from Qatar, from the Emirates, from Saudi Arabia, and so on. And we're not sure what the Iranian role is right now. The Iranians are otherwise occupied with their own problems, snapback, and so on. There's a chance there. The fact that there's so much suffering and destruction in Gaza means that even Hamas would find it hard to avoid the pressure. And yet, I still remain more like you, and perhaps it has to do with our age and not wisdom, but experience at least. I remain highly suspicious of the outcome because we've seen so much of this fail in the past. One thing I should mention is what's the alternative? We've been through so much misery by now. How does the public, that I'm worried more about the public in Israel, how does Israeli public opinion react if there's another failure? If we know that more hostages are going to be murdered and more soldiers' lives are going to be lost if we're pushed into trying to finally teach Hamas a lesson or whatever. This is a horrific outcome in my view, even from a very narrow Israeli perspective.
Last week, around the UN, there was a whole lot of apparently separate diplomatic activity, which was the rush of countries to recognize a Palestinian state. And as part of that, in the New York Declaration, led by France and Saudi Arabia, there was this extra point which a lot of Arab countries signed on to, which was the isolation of Hamas. The sort of small print of this recognition said there can be no role for Hamas. Hamas would have to be out of the picture. They would be disarmed and so on. Is there any connection between the move that allowed many of these Arab states to come on board to that position, which was in return for European and other recognition of a Palestinian state, and the fact that you've got Arab countries now signed up for this Trump plan that does include the isolation, the shunning of Hamas? In the diplomatic dance, it seemed as if Trump was in one place against recognition of a Palestinian state. Macron and Starmer, the others, were in a completely different place. And I just wondered, watching last night, Monday night, whether or not there had been actually some link between these two dances that perhaps had not been obviously visible.
My suspicion is that in spite of the fact that the Europeans are tired of Trump and afraid of him and so on, that there's some level of coordination that has to do both with the fight in the war in Ukraine and what's going on with Israel. Is Trump smart and manipulative enough to push the Europeans to one move and then suggest something else? I'm not sure. My sense is that there's something very aggressive, something very brutal about all his activities, everything he says and so on, and that he's having a hard time to coordinate movements. And yet the fact that the Gulf states are so involved right now, for me, considering the options, that's a good alternative. It's a finally, again, the silver lining. I don't know how to define this exactly, but there's finally a possibility of a way out, something that we haven't seen for quite some time. And Jonathan, we had those conversations. Think about when was it? In April, when they sat together at the summit, and there were all those expectations, and suddenly Trump discussed this beautiful transfer plan he had, or later on the Riviera AI vision of Gaza. Considering the alternatives, this is the best way forward. And you can't wipe out what has happened in the last 2 years. There's so much that happened. We need a way out from this. We need to gradually climb out of this mess. And that's, in spite of all the reservations I have about the president, I have to give him credit for that. At least he's trying right now. At least he's focused on this. And apparently, and for the time being, this is what he's trying to achieve.
That is the very good place to close. Just before we do, though, you mentioned that there is another story you're working on that we should have on our radar as we go into the next 24 hours. What's that?
That's the flotilla. Dozens and dozens of ships and boats on their way, began in Spain, if I'm not mistaken, through Italy and on their way to Gaza Strip. They want to save Gaza. Activists, pro-Palestinians are involved. Hundreds of people on board these ships. Israel announced that it's preparing to block their way to Gaza. You may recall the Malma affair, the Mavi Malma affair in May 2010. Turkish activists at that time, a lot of bloodshed, an Israeli attempt to control a ship. 9 Turkish citizens were killed by the IDF after they attacked Israeli Navy SEALs once they climbed on board. We remember that. And I think one thing is that this is a serious event happening as we speak, and that could go wrong. A second theory I should mention is that there might be people on both sides that will find this as a useful diversion if things are finally going to stabilize. So this could be an excuse to bring even more misery to the region. We'll have to see how this plays out. I really hope that the Israeli army knows what it's doing, because this is quite a provocation and it could end quite badly.
Amos, we will keep an eye on that. We are going into the next 24 hours. Also, of course, many of our listeners will be marking Yom Kippur, so we wish them Gemar Chatima Tova. May they be inscribed in the book of life. I think that's a good wish. I think it was the wish, actually, the Prime Minister Netanyahu himself closed the event in the White House with. So we send those good wishes to you. And Amos, thank you very much for being on board for this unholy special update.
Thank you, Jonathan. Shana Tova.